There's a notation in the margin of Samuel Bridger's trail journal, dated June 14, 1841, written in pencil so faint that subsequent archivists nearly missed it entirely. It reads, "Third night we hear keeping pace. No one will speak of it by daylight." The entry itself, written in ink just above this note, describes nothing unusual. Mileage covered, conditions of the oxen, a spring found 2 miles north of the expected position. But that pencil mark, added later, perhaps by firelight or in the gray hour before dawn, suggests something Bridger could not bring himself to include in the formal record. Something that walked alongside the wagons in darkness. Something that matched their rhythms so precisely that it became part of the journey itself. Unacknowledged but always present. The Santa Fe Trail in the summer of 1841 saw the passage of at least 7 documented wagon parties, trading expeditions carrying manufactured goods southwest toward Mexican territory, returning with silver, furs, and woven goods. It was a wilderness road worn smooth by thousands of footsteps and wheel tracks, yet it was never a comfortable passage. The distance between settlements could span a week or more. The grass ocean of the plains stretched unbroken to horizons that seemed to curve away from the earth itself. At night, the darkness was total, and in that darkness, more than one party reported that they were not alone. The Santa Fe Trail was not a single road, but a network of routes, shifting slightly each season according to water sources, grass quality, and the movements of indigenous nations whose lands these crossings violated. By 1841, the trail had been in formal use for 2 decades, since William Becknell's first successful trading expedition established the route as profitable. Merchants from Missouri would gather their wagons in Independence or Franklin, form companies for mutual protection, and set out across 800 miles of prairie, desert, and canyon country toward the Mexican settlements of New Mexico. Travel occurred primarily in spring and summer, when water was available and grass could sustain livestock. Even so, the passage was arduous. Wagons broke down. Axles snapped on hidden stones. Oxen died from exhaustion or poisoned water. Men fell ill with dysentery, fever, or injuries that festered in the heat. The isolation was profound. 4 days at a time, a wagon train might encounter no other human beings. Only the vast tilting expanse of grassland, the cry of hawks, the distant smudge of dust that might be buffalo or might be something else entirely. Samuel Bridger's company departed Independence on May 29, 1841. There were 11 wagons in total, 42 men, no women. Bridger himself was the elected captain, a dry goods merchant from Kentucky, making his 3rd journey along the trail. His journal, preserved in the archives of the Kansas State Historical Society, is notably thorough. He recorded daily mileage, the quality of grazing, the behavior of livestock, encounters with other travelers, and observations about terrain. His handwriting is neat, his tone measured and practical. He was not a man inclined toward exaggeration. The first 2 weeks of travel were uneventful by frontier standards. The company covered between 12 and 18 miles per day, depending on conditions. They crossed the Kansas River without incident, forded several smaller tributaries, and encountered a southbound party near Council Grove that reported good grass and no trouble ahead. Weather was mild. Nights were cool. Men took turns on watch, rotating every few hours so that no one lost too much sleep. Bridger's entries from this period are sparse, concerned chiefly with logistics. But on June 12th, 2 days past the last timber country, the tone begins to shift. The entry for that day notes, wind steady from the northwest, dust raised all afternoon, made camp early on account of poor grazing ahead, men restless. There is no elaboration on the restlessness. The following day's entry is shorter, 14 miles. Johnson's Ox-Lamed, delayed 2 hours. And then the June 14th entry, with its penciled margin note. It is worth considering what it meant to make a private notation in a trail journal. These were not diaries in the modern sense. They were working documents, sometimes copied and shared among traders to map water sources or warn of hazards. Every word might be read by others. To add a note in pencil, off to the side, implied something the author did not wish to formalize but could not ignore. Third night we hear keeping pace. Third night, meaning it had begun earlier, on June 12th, the day Bridger noted the men were restless. No other journal from that particular company survives, but a letter written 2 months later by a man named Elias Cobb, who traveled with Bridger's party, mentions a journey in passing. Cobb was writing to his brother in Ohio, and most of the letter concerns prices and profits. But near the end, almost as an afterthought, he adds, "The crossing was difficult this year, more so than I anticipated. We heard things at night I cannot account for. I do not expect to travel that country again." He does not describe what he heard. He does not elaborate on why he will not return. The statement is brief and absolute. The plains at night were not silent, though they often felt that way. There was wind, always wind, moving through grass with a sound like water rushing over stones. There were insects, small creatures moving unseen, the occasional distant howl of wolves or coyotes. Men grew accustomed to these sounds. They learned to distinguish the ordinary from the noteworthy. A stampede had a rhythm. Predators had patterns. Even storms announced themselves with changes in pressure, scent, the behavior of animals. But what Bridger's men began to notice on the night of June 12th followed no familiar pattern. It began, according to the few scattered references we have, as a sound of footsteps, not close, but not distant either, somewhere just beyond the firelight, moving parallel to the circled wagons. The night watch heard it first. One man, whose name is not recorded, mentioned it to his replacement when the watch changed. The second man heard it as well. By morning, neither spoke of it openly, but both were visibly tired. This detail, men losing sleep but not discussing the cause, appears again in another source. A trader named Hugh Darrow, who crossed the trail 4 years later in 1845, recorded a conversation with a Mexican muleteer in Santa Fe. The muleteer, an older man who had worked the trail for many years, mentioned certain stretches of country where traders would insist on doubling the night watch, though they would not say why. "They do not want to hear it alone," the muleteer said, according to Darrow's account. "It is better if another man is awake. Then you know you are not imagining." What the guards in Bridger's company heard that first night was regular. It matched the rhythm of a walking man. It did not approach, but it did not fade. It kept exact pace with the patrol route around the wagons, as though something were circling just outside the perimeter, staying always at the same distance, adjusting its speed to match. When the second night brought the same sound, clearer this time, other men began to hear it. Those trying to sleep in their bedrolls, wrapped in blankets beneath the wagons, heard the footsteps passing close. Some later said it sounded like boots on hard ground, though the earth or soft prairie soil that should have muffled any step. Others said it was barefoot, a padding sound, deliberate and unhurried. No one agreed on the details, but everyone agreed on the presence. By the third night, the night Bridger made his penciled note, the silence around the fire had become oppressive. Men spoke less. They kept their conversations brief and practical. No one made jokes. When the watch changed, the outgoing guard would return to the fire and sit close to the flames, staring into the coals, saying nothing. Bridger's journal entry for June 15th reads, 16 miles. Grass thin. No wood for fires. Used buffalo chips. Sighted wagon ruts heading southwest. Possibly Greg's party from last season. Nothing about the nights. Nothing about the restlessness that must have been worsening. But the entry is shorter than usual, and the handwriting, though still neat, is slightly uneven, as if written quickly or by someone whose attention was divided. There is a phenomena, well documented among travelers in isolated places, where the mind begins to construct patterns from insufficient information. Men alone in darkness hear footsteps in the wind. Sailors see shapes in the fog. Miners imagine voices in the deep shafts. It is a known fragility of human perception, particularly under stress, particularly when sleep is scarce. But this assumes the sounds were imagined, and the problem with that explanation is the consistency. On the fourth night, June 15th, something changed. The footsteps, if that is what they were, did not circle the camp. They stopped, according to Elias Cobb's letter, which remains our only secondary account. One of the men claimed he saw it standing at the edge of visibility, just past where the firelight reached. He did not describe it. He refused to go on watch the following night and had to be threatened with expulsion from the company. Bridger's journal makes no mention of this incident, but the entry for June 16th is a single line, 13 miles, hard travel, no explanation, no detail, just those two words. After June 16th, the journal entries become irregular. Some days are missing entirely. Others contain only mileage and location, without the usual observations about conditions or morale. It is as though Bridger stopped wanting to record what was happening, or perhaps stopped trusting that his account would be believed. But there are clues in what he does not write. On June 18th, the entry reads, "Laid over, repairs." A layover was expensive. Traders lost money for every day they did not travel, and repairs could usually be managed on a move unless something serious had broken. No explanation is given for what needed repairing or why it required a full day. A separate document, a bill of sale filed in Santa Fe later that summer, lists Samuel Bridger as having sold a wagon and team in poor condition for significantly less than market value, damaged in transit. The date on the bill suggests it was one of the wagons from his own company. Why would a wagon be so badly damaged that it had to be sold at a loss? What happened during that layover? We do not know. Bridger does not say. But in the margin beside the June 18th entry, there is another pencil mark, this one even fainter. Two men refuse to travel further in darkness. We move only by daylight now. This is extraordinary. Moving only by daylight meant stopping early, making camp while the sun was still up, and remaining in place until dawn. It cut daily mileage significantly. It increased the risk of running low on supplies before reaching the next settlement. No cautious trader would make that decision lightly. The danger would have to be immediate and undeniable. What could justify such a choice? The footsteps had continued night after night. But by this point, according to fragments we can piece together from other sources, they were no longer just footsteps. Men reported hearing breathing, slow, steady, unnaturally close. Others heard what they described as a dragging sound, something heavy being pulled across the ground just beyond the wagons. One man claimed he heard his own name spoken softly, from a direction where no one was standing. This last detail appears not in Bridger's journal, but in a much later account, a reminiscence published in a Missouri newspaper in 1869. The author, identified only as a veteran of the Santa Fe trade, described an incident on the trail nearly 30 years earlier, where a member of our company heard his name called in the dark, in a voice he recognized as his brother's, though his brother had died 2 winters previous in Pennsylvania. The man did not answer. He sat by the fire until dawn and would not move. Whether this refers to Bridger's company is unclear, but the year 1841 matches and the description of the conditions matches. The article continues, "We made a rule after that night. No man was to answer if he heard his name in the darkness. No man was to step outside the circle of wagons after the fire was lit. We traveled as quickly as we could and did not stop until we reached timber country again." Timber country. Trees. Cover. The plains were unbearable because they offered no concealment, no boundary between the camp and the enormous empty dark surrounding it. In forested land, the darkness had shape. It had limits. On the plains, it went on forever, and anything could be standing in it, unseen and unseeable, just beyond reach. By June 21st, Bridger's company had covered less than half the usual distance they should have managed in 3 weeks. They were behind schedule, running low on certain provisions, and morale had deteriorated to the point where the train's cohesion was in question. Men were arguing. Some wanted to turn back. Others insisted on pushing forward, faster. Damn the oxen and damn the caution. Bridger, trying to hold the group together, was caught between factions. His journal entry for that day is longer than the recent ones, almost as though he felt compelled to explain himself, if only to the page. We are not a superstitious company. These are practical men, men who have faced storm and sickness and the real dangers of this country. They do not frighten easily. But something follows us. I can no longer deny it. Every night it draws closer. Last night Morrison swore he felt a hand on his shoulder while standing watch. Though no man was near him, he showed us the place on his jacket where the fabric was disturbed, pressed inward as if by fingers. I have no explanation. We are still 5 days from the Arkansas crossing, longer if we continue at this pace. I have begun to fear we will not arrive intact. This is the only place in the surviving journal where Bridger openly acknowledges the presence. He does not describe it. He does not theorize. He simply states that something is following them and that he is afraid. Morrison, the man who felt the hand on his shoulder, does not appear in any later records. His name vanishes from the roster after June 21st. There is no note of illness, no mention of death or desertion. He is simply absent from subsequent references, as though he stepped out of the historical record entirely. Others in the company began to behave strangely. One man stopped speaking altogether, communicating only in nods and gestures. Another refused to sleep, sitting upright by the fire every night until he finally collapsed from exhaustion and had to be carried in one of the wagons for 2 days. A third man began insisting that they were being watched during the day as well, not just at night, that something was pacing along the low ridges to the south, staying parallel, never falling behind. Bridger's journal does not confirm this, but it does not deny it either. The entry for June 23rd reads, "Made 15 miles. Saw dust to the south, source unknown. Dust to the south. In still air, dust does not rise on its own." The night of June 24th, 1841, is the last night Bridger describes in any detail. They had made camp in a shallow depression, a slight fold in the prairie that offered minimal shelter from the wind. There was no wood. They burned dried buffalo dung, which gave off a thin, acrid smoke and less heat than timber. The fire was small and sullen. The men gathered close to it, crowded together in a way that suggested they were seeking comfort in proximity rather than warmth. Bridger assigned a watch as usual, doubling it despite the cost to everyone's rest. 4 men at a time, positioned at the cardinal points around the circle wagons, each within sight of at least one other guard. No one was to be alone. No one was to wander beyond the perimeter. The night was still. There was no wind, which was unusual for that country. The grass did not move. The air felt dense, as though the sky had lowered, pressing down on the camp. Stars were visible but seemed distant, their light faint and cold. Around midnight, according to Bridger's account, the guards began to hear it again. Footsteps, circling the camp, but this time not at the edge of the firelight. Closer, much closer, moving between the wagons. One of the guards called out, asking who was there. No answer. The footsteps continued, steady and unhurried, moving to the camp itself now, passing within feet of where men lay trying to sleep. Someone sat up, holding a lantern high, and for a moment everyone was still, listening. The sound stopped. Then it resumed from a different direction. Behind them now, then to the left, then ahead, moving faster, circling tighter, as though whatever made the sound was drawing the circle inward, spiraling toward the fire where the men were gathered. Bridger wrote, "We could hear it walking among us. We could hear its weight on the ground, the sound of its passage disturbing the grass. But we could not see it. Lanterns showed nothing. The space where the sound came from was empty. It walked through our camp as though we were not there, or as though it had always been there and we were the intrusion." One man broke. He stood up, shouted something incoherent, and lunged toward the sound, swinging a long-handled axe at the empty air. He struck nothing. The blade buried itself in the ground, and he fell to his knees, gasping, staring at the place where the sound had been. The footsteps stopped. For several minutes, no one moved. The fire crackled. The night pressed close. Then, from somewhere outside the wagons, beyond the circle but not far beyond, they heard something else. Bridger's description is careful, almost clinical, as though he were trying to distance himself from what he was recording. It was a voice, or something approximating a voice. It spoke no words I recognized, though the cadence suggested speech. It was low and continuous, like someone reciting or chanting, just below the threshold of understanding. It did not grow louder or softer. It did not move. It simply persisted, filling the silence until one of the men began to weep and another begged aloud for it to stop. How long this continued, Bridger does not say. His entry ends abruptly. We did not sleep. At first light we moved on. The following days are documented only in fragments. Bridger's journal entries become terse, sometimes just a single word. Traveled. 14 miles. Cross Creek. There is no mention of the nights. There is no mention of the presence. But the gaps in the record speak loudly. Whole days are missing. The handwriting becomes erratic. In one place, a line is scratched out so heavily that the paper is torn. From other sources, we know the company reached the Arkansas River crossing on June 29th, 5 days later than expected. They were met there by a Mexican trader heading east, who later reported that Bridger's men were silent and hollow-eyed, moving like men who had not rested in weeks. The trader offered to travel with them for mutual protection, but Bridger declined. According to the Mexican's account, Bridger told him, "We travel alone. It follows only us." The trader did not ask what it referred to. He moved on quickly. Bridger's company continued southwest, into the broken country, approaching the Cimarron cutoff. The terrain there was harsher, the heat more intense, water sources less reliable. Normally, this would be the most dangerous portion of the journey. But for Bridger's men, it seemed to come as a relief. The presence, whatever it had been on the open plains, grew less distinct as the landscape grew more varied. Or perhaps it simply stopped. Bridger's journal resumes more regular entries after July 3rd. The tone is still subdued, but the terror has faded, replaced by exhaustion and a kind of numb determination. On July 8th, he writes, "We have left the open country. The nights are quiet now. Men are sleeping again, though some still wake suddenly and will not say why." They reached Santa Fe on July 14th, 1841, more than 2 weeks behind schedule. Bridger sold his goods, settled his accounts, and prepared for the return journey. But he did not return with the same company. Most of the men refused to travel the trail again. Some took employment in Santa Fe. Others joined different parties heading back by alternate routes, longer but through timber country. Bridger himself made one more trip along the Santa Fe Trail in the spring of 1842, but his journal from that journey is brief and impersonal, containing none of the detail that characterizes earlier entries. After that, he disappears from the trading records. No death notice, no further journals. He simply stopped traveling. In the years following 1841, several other parties reported similar experiences on the Central Plains portion of the Santa Fe Trail. None were as extensively documented as Bridger's, but the patterns were consistent. Footsteps at night, sound of something pacing the wagons, voices in the darkness, men refusing to travel alone or after sunset. A journal entry from 1843, written by a trader named William Tharp, mentions the section of country between Council Grove and the Arkansas where men hear things they will not name. Tharp does not elaborate, but he notes that his company doubled the night watch and moved as quickly as possible through that stretch, as is customary, meaning it had become common practice, a known precaution, something traders warn each other about. Yet official records say almost nothing. Government reports on trail conditions, military surveys, emigrant guides, none mention the phenomenon. It existed entirely in the private writings of the men who experienced it. Journals, letters, marginal notes. Things written for oneself or for family, not for public consumption. Why the silence? Perhaps because there was no vocabulary for it. In the 1840s, the American frontier was understood as a place of material dangers, whether disease, conflict with indigenous nations, animal predators, accidents. There was no framework for discussing something that could not be seen, that left no physical evidence, that violated the rules of the natural world. To report such a thing officially would invite ridicule or suspicion of madness. So it was spoken of quietly, if at all. Traders shared warnings in vague terms. Guides adjusted routes without explanation. Certain stretches of country were avoided during particular seasons, and no one asked why. By the 1850s, traffic on the Santa Fe Trail had increased significantly. The reports of strange encounters decreased, though whether this was because the presence had faded or simply because the sheer volume of travelers made it harder to isolate individual experiences is unclear. There is one final reference worth noting. In 1869, the same year the Missouri newspaper published the veteran trader's reminiscence, a researcher named Dr. Howard Westfield conducted a series of interviews with retired trail men for a historical project that was never completed. His notes, archived at the University of Missouri, include a brief conversation with a man who claimed to have traveled with Bridger's 1841 company, though his name does not appear on any roster. Westfield asked if the man remembered anything unusual about that journey. The man was silent for a long time. Then he said, "It walked with us for 2 weeks. Every night. We never saw it, but we all knew it was there. Some of the men tried to tell themselves it was imagination, exhaustion, the stress of travel. But that didn't explain why we all heard the same things at the same time. It didn't explain why it knew our names." Westfield asked what the man thought it was. "I don't know," the man said. "I stopped trying to know. But I'll tell you this. Whatever it wasn't following us. It was escorting us, like it had a right to be there, like we were the ones who didn't belong. The Santa Fe Trail is gone now, in the sense that roads are gone when highways replace them. The ruts are still visible in some places, faint scars in the prairie grass, but no wagons travel them. The landscape has been divided by fences, crossed by power lines, mapped and measured, and made manageable. But the nights are still dark there. The plains still stretch to horizons that curve away from the earth. And if you were to stand in that country after sunset, far from any town or farmhouse, you would find that the wind still sounds like something moving through the grass, that the silence between gusts feels occupied, that the darkness seems to have a presence of its own, patient and attentive, as though it were waiting for something or someone to pass through. Samuel Bridger's journal, the bulk of it, remains in the archives. Researchers consult occasionally for details about trail conditions, trading practices, daily routines of the 1840s frontier. The pencil margin notes are usually ignored, considered personal and irrelevant to the historical record. But they are there, faint, nearly invisible, written by a man who could not bring himself to speak aloud what he had experienced, but who also could not let it pass unrecorded. Third night we hear it keeping pace. We do not know what it was. We do not know why it followed Bridger's company and not others, or why it stopped when it did. We do not know if it was a single presence or something that has always been there, woven into the fabric of that particular stretch of country, older than the trail, older than the settlements, older than the names we gave to the land. We know only that men heard it, that they feared it, that some of them carried a memory of it for the rest of their lives, waking in the night decades later, listening for footsteps that were no longer there. And we know that the trail is still there under the highways and the fields, under the layers of time and forgetting, waiting, perhaps, still listening, still keeping pace.